Welcome, welcome, welcome. Thank you. Thank you so much for joining us here in the library today. My name is Rebecca Lubas. I'm the Dean of Libraries here at CSUSB, and I want to thank the fabulous partners that have made this possible. The Faculty Center for Excellence is having us in their beautiful space. The San Manuel Student Union has been a sponsor, and also the Hispanic Heritage Month celebration committee has also been a supporter. So thank you for making this possible. And it is my pleasure today to hand off to the person who's properly going to introduce our esteemed speaker, our very own Dr. Guillermo Aviles Rodriguez. And he is going to introduce our speaker and say a few words. And I also want to put in a plug that he's going to be a featured speaker next month for a very exciting program. So keep that in mind.
So good afternoon, everyone. And thank you for joining us for this special event, both in person and virtually, as part of this CSUSB Library Present series. So I'd like to begin by acknowledging the incredible individuals who have made this series possible, including Thin Lee from the Technology Support Center, Evelyn Figueroa, Rebecca Hoffland, Manny Verone, and Robie Madrigal. And they're all from the, Pfau Library, absolutely. Their efforts have ensured this event is brought to life, and they're deeply appreciated. So it is an honor to deliver tonight's introduction for Dr. Natalia Molina and her latest work, A Place at the Nayarit, How a Mexican Restaurant Nourished a Community. This book holds special meaning for me, particularly because my personal connection to the Silver Lake neighborhood that's featured within the book's pages. I feel connected to the very streets, histories, and communities that Dr. Molina so vividly brings to life. But more than just a historical recounting, this book challenges us to look deeper into the urban spaces where stories of resilience and community building unfold, often led by immigrants, laborers, and people who have been marginalized by traditional narratives. A Place at the Nayarit speaks to the radical act of reclaiming and telling these forgotten stories. Stories of resilience, survival, and quiet acts of defiance against structures of exclusion and erasure. The Nayarit, the restaurant that serves as the centerpiece of this narrative, was more than a place to eat. It was a sanctuary where immigrant, queer patrons, and working class Angelinos could find belonging. It was a place where people who were often excluded or marginalized by the city could gather, offering not just food, but also pride, solidarity, and community. Dr. Molina's work reminds us of the power of place and how spaces like the Nayarit become centers of community, shaping the fabric of our city. Her careful scholarship deconstructs the power dynamics behind race, class, and identity, showing us how these forces influence everyday life. In an era where immigrants are force-fed shame, the Nayarit became an urban anchor where they could feast on pride, belonging, and solidarity. In a time when issues like gentrification, displacement, cultural commodification are even more pronounced in neighborhoods like Echo Park, Dr. Molina's book is a powerful and timely call to remember and honor communities who built these spaces. In a time where these dynamics are becoming even more pronounced, Dr. Molina's work is a timely reminder that the communities who built these spaces should not be erased or replaced, but documented, celebrated, and supported. So now a little bit more about our esteemed guest. Dr. Molina is a distinguished professor and Dean's Professor of American Studies and Ethnicity at the University of Southern California. She has authored 3 critically acclaimed books, including How Race is Made in America and Fit to be a Citizen. Her latest work, A Place at the Nayarit, has garnered praise from the Los Angeles Times and was a finalist for the James Beard Award. In her upcoming book, The Silent Hands That Shaped the Huntington Library, Dr. Molina continues her commitment to documenting the lives of underrepresented communities. Her research is an act of resistance, ensuring that the contributions of immigrants, workers, and others are not lost to history. Her impact in the field of American Studies has been recognized with a MacArthur Fellowship in 2020, and it's a testament to the significance of her work. So please join me, without any further ado, in welcoming, give her a warm Coyote welcome, Dr. Natalia Molina.
That was so beautiful. I think you have a sense of the book already, so I might just open to Q&A. Thank you. The force-fed shame and feast on that. I'm going to have to ask you for that introductory remarks. That was just, I'm honored. Thank you. I'm from a Cal State family. My brother, my husband, my nephew, hopefully my future nieces and nephews as they're applying for college in the next few years. And yet I rarely get to come to a Cal State campus. So I'm so excited to be here. I've already enjoyed my visit, walking through your campus, walking through the library, seeing the good people of Cal State San Bernardino sipping their Starbucks and writing their papers. Everybody was hard at work. So I just want to say thank you very much for the invitation, and thank you especially to Robie Madrigal, who made it so easy to come here. I want to talk to you about storytelling. I was talking to my best friend today. I'm giving this talk today. You know, it's Hispanic Heritage Month, so I'm on the road. So I'm giving this talk today, and then on Sunday I'm giving a talk to a small group of donors for the University of California Press, because you know, presses are like our public universities. They need support. And I was telling her that they just sent the guest list to me, and one of the guests was a former judge, former ambassador, right? Like he's Latino, first Latino on the California State Supreme Court. On and on and on, you know, all the accolades. And yet he comes, I think this will be like the 4th talk that he comes to. And as I was talking to her, I realized, you know, he's connected because he wants to hear about Latino history because he never got to hear it growing up. He never got to see people like himself reflected in storybooks. He never got in textbooks, in classes. So we forget sometimes, I still forget sometimes, what an honor, what a privilege it is to be in a space where we get to hear about our communities and to hear about why that erasure has happened. And because of that, I want to talk to you about storytelling. It's me and my brother David, when we were little. I've always been fascinated by the power of a good story, long before I became a historian. And it makes perfect sense because in my family, storytelling was key. And much of that storytelling took place around my Aunt Vicky's kitchen table in the morning over coffee. And they would talk to me about everything, about our family in Mexico, about the journey to the US, about those who went back and those who went back and forth. And I got to hear about our family, our place in the community, our place in history, and the importance of immigrants and how we help shape this country. So it was a real shock to me as I grew older and I went out into the world to not see myself reflected in textbooks, in school lesson plans, in the media, except really as a flattened cultural type. Even today, Latinos only make up about 4% of speaking roles in Hollywood. And so as I went out into the world and started to learn about history, I really wanted to understand how do we write ourselves into history? And so one of the first projects that I undertook was when I was an undergraduate, like many of you. I went to UCLA I took a class on the history of LA, and the professor who taught it, George Sanchez, was teaching us about some of these things, and that we're still fighting for today. And this was, in the early 90s. And so my first research project was on the construction of the East Los Angeles Freeway. Now there are books about it, or people have written about it. George Sanchez in his Boyle Heights book. I mentioned it briefly in my Fit to Be Citizens book. There's a great documentary on the East LA Exchange. So there's lots of ways you can learn about it now. But at the time, really very few people had written about it, and just kind of in smaller ways. And so I went and did archival research. I went into the library, into the special collections part of the library. I don't know where I would be without librarians and archives. And I looked through the papers of Edward Roybal, the city councilman for Boyle Heights at the time. And I saw that people had sent in their petitions saying, we don't want a freeway built in East LA. And he had it in his archives, and they were like pieces of paper about the size of my palm. And then people would write, sign their names like all around it and on the back. And you could see the scarcity of resources even in their petition, right? Like, this is the paper we have, we're like passing it around. And that stood in contrast to the next folder that I pulled out, and I opened it. And there, in like that thick, nice paper, embossed letterhead, was the petition from the attorneys of the people in Beverly Hills that they too didn't want a freeway built in their neighborhood. And we see which one won, because this is the aerial view of the junction of the East Los Angeles freeways as they started to build. And there were a lot of, this was not like a secret. They did a lot of open planning. I mentioned that because I went to a talk for the architect who's helping design the gondolas that they're trying to propose for Dodger Stadium, and an eighth grader got up and asked them, like, what about the communities that you're going to displace in doing this? And he kind of looked at his shoes, like he was so lost in trying, nobody, like, right when you actually speak truth to power. And he said, well, we're getting a lot of community input. That's what's different. It's like, no, we've always got a community input. We ignore community input. And for this freeway system, I wanted to show you how much we ignore community. I wanted to show you a picture of the people protesting this. There are no pictures. There are pictures of the last, there are no pictures of the community protesting this. What we have is all the top down, the institutional, the view from the top, not the view from the bottom, from the community looking up. And this is literally a view from the top down, right? An aerial view. So I don't have those sources to show you about the community. And that's why one of the terms that I use in the book, which I'll talk about, is the underdocumented. Those who we don't document enough. And I really play on this term, so like undocumented, but even people with citizenship rights, even people who've been here from generations, their voices are not often acknowledged. This kind of history was so new when I started doing it. Despite ethnic studies waging all these important battles, this history was still so new that in 2000, when I was writing my dissertation, the LA Times did an article on it, a new place in history, right? Like, wow, there are people of color, there are immigrants, there are working class folks. She's writing about it along with these other folks. Like, no, this is not new. It's that we don't listen to these voices. We don't try to document, or many of us do, but it's not received readily in institutions, which is why we're still always fighting these battles, always having to document these battles. One way in which we do that, so I wanted to give you a sense of method. So as I know, some of you are working on your honors thesis or your senior thesis. One way we do this, because we don't have a lot of records left behind, is by what we call reading against the grain. So if you picture like a piece of wood, if you run your hand against it with the grain, it's really smooth. But if you run it against it, it's rough. And so some in ethnic studies will often call reading these kinds of sources that are put out by institutions as against the grain. So here we have an article from the LA Times in 1970, and it says hell starts with a tub. And these are the nurses who educate the foreign born. Many of them were born in the US, but they're labeled as foreign born. And they visit them at their homes and they talk to them about cleanliness as if, they're not clean. And so, they talk about the children of being foreign born due to the lack of knowledge as to how to care for them. And so they have to do these little mothers classes. So you get a sense of the source, right? And so it's also a way of saying, well, how did the people in the photo actually think about this? How did the mothers in these classes think about it? Are there hints that tell us that? And so one is, if you keep reading the article, the health officers are like, they seem really resistant to coming to our classes. They must not want to know about cleanliness. Or they might not want to be told they're dirty, right? There are lots of readings that you could do. So that's an example of the kind of ways in which, even with the underdocumented, you can start to tell these stories. And this is what I've done for over 20 years now, to talk about how institutions shape these ideas about race, whether it be through public health and Fit to Be Citizens, or How Race is Made in America, which is the Immigration, Citizenship, and Historical Power of Racial Scripts book. And this book is based on records found at the National Archives. And I'm on the board at the Library of Congress, and we just had our meeting. And the former library head of the National Archives is now on our board. And we were talking about, like, how can we help people come to the library more? How can we give more fellowships out? And we know it's hard to get away from your campus, for professors to get away from their campuses, both for lots of reasons, personal, funding, you have to move. So should we also think about doing virtual fellowships, make it more flexible? And one of the things that the National Archives person said was, yes, he completely understood that. And yet there's a power in being in person and communicating with one another, especially for the librarians, the special collections folks, the people at the National Archives, because they don't always know what's fully in the archives until the students, the researchers, activate it for them. Because it's not just what's in the archive, it's the questions we ask about it, right? Which is why your professors have you read the literature and think about, like, what the key questions are and how they change over time. So yeah, so just the importance of, like, us asking questions. They have the information, but we're the ones that can activate those archives. We're the ones that can ask the tough questions. A lot of my work has been focused on LA, and a lot of the history of LA reads like a PR slogan, like an advertisement. Why? Because it was, right? What we called people in LA in the early 20th century who were really trying to promote it were boosters. We're trying to boost LA's image. LA was growing, right? People were coming here, so they wanted to promote it as a land of sunshine. And it wasn't just, the PR people, it was also the health officials, all the people using health as a way to get people to come. The salubrious sun, the life-giving climate, the mountain, like just all the ways that they would talk about this. But of course, this is who they were talking to. They were really picturing LA, the cult in our imagination. LA was a healthy space, and implied in that was a white space. This is who they were really trying to talk to. An exercise class at the beach in Santa Monica. When we think LA, and historically, you're probably more likely to think of this than this, right? The Latinos who actually came here in the early 20th century, and that's when we see Latinos coming to the U.S. during and after the Mexican Revolution. Many of them men. Of course, LA and the Southwest had been once part of Mexico until 1848 with the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. If you're interested in this and want more, and for your classes, there's a new documentary series that premieres on Friday with John Leguizamo. It's the history of Latino America, and that's on Fridays at PBS at some time. So and it's 3 episodes, so it's 3 consecutive Fridays, because we don't hear about this history. So we see that this kind of idea of the land of sunshine is in contrast to that, right? When Mexicans, Latinos do appear, they appear kind of as this Latin stereotype. So here we see an orange crate label, and that this kind of Spanish fantasy past. I was a study center director for our study abroad program in the UC system for a year. And so I made friends in Spain, and then I was living in San Diego at the time when they would come visit me, and I would take them to Balboa Park, and they're like, "What? Why does it look like Seville here? Why you like why it?" And this wasn't built like when this was Spain. This was built in the 1900s. Where I'm like, "Oh, we erase our Mexican past here." That's one of the lessons that you can learn when coming to the U.S. We only embrace the Spanish part, right? So we see this Fiesta brand. And we don't see the complexity. We don't often talk about like the immigrants that built this land. So, you know, when we hear, as we will so much, especially with the presidential election, even when defending immigrants, it's we are a land of immigrants. But what we don't say is, and we treated them really badly, right? Like they had terrible jobs. They were doing the hardest work out here. And that hasn't changed. They still are. So there's this way in which we kind of glorify immigration, but without actually talking about the working conditions. And that's where my Huntington project comes from. The Huntington Library in Pasadena, San Marino, that it's often like seen as just this glorious space, and it's attributed to Henry Huntington. But it's these folks really that were the ones that built it. And so after a while of doing this kind of work, you also think, I also want to talk about joy. I also want to drink a little water. Just one second. I want to also explain that by talking about joy, I don't want to minimize those hardships that I just mentioned. I don't want to say that it was always a joyful life. But if we only go through the archive, those records are like of unions, of strikes, of police records, of those public health officials. And we don't always get a sense that people lived a three-dimensional life. And yes, of course, Latinos, immigrants were working hard, and they had their head down, and they were, you know, doing everything that they could to make a better life for themselves and especially their next generation. But if we don't see them as full human beings, we also forget, like, oh yeah, these folks were also deserving of rights and of civil rights. And we also need to see that they also had joyous moments. And so I write about that in my book, A Place at the Nayarit, How Mexican Restaurant Nourished a Community. And it's based on my grandmother's restaurant. And my grandmother passed before I was born, and the restaurant closed when I was a little girl. But I wanted to write about it for a few reasons. And one of them is that a lot of these spaces, as you know, was said, are being gentrified. We're forgetting this history. I was really motivated to write the book when I would come up to LA. I was living in San Diego, but my family's here in LA. And I would come up to LA, and I would go to a party and meet someone I didn't know, and they'd say, "Oh, you're in LA? You're visiting from San Diego? Where are you staying?" I'd say, "Oh, Echo Park." "Oh, is it a good Airbnb?" I'm like, "No, my mom's. People live there. Like people have lived there for generations." It's like that way that it had just been erased. Or, "Oh, Echo Park. Wow, there's so many changes. You must love it." Why would I love that my aunt's, you know, little mom and pop store closed and now there's a coffee shop there because they raised the rent 4 times? Right? There's this way in which we tend to see things in one way, one light or another, without seeing these complicated histories. And I knew that just like I had these spaces that I call urban anchors that really anchor the community, other people did too, right? Those restaurants you go to, the coffee shop, the bar, all these, you know, the places where people gather and community gather that we don't always have on our radar. So I wanted to write a book about that. But I did want to tell you that also that part of what made it difficult to write the book was also not just that these communities were underdocumented, but was my own self-censorship, where I had gotten the message as an undergraduate and somewhat into graduate school, but really as an undergraduate, that we shouldn't write about these histories that are so close to us, that they're too close, that we would be seen as unbiased, and we have to do this rigorous scholarship. And so I had hesitated to write about it. And so by the time that I did start to write about it, a lot of the people that I could have interviewed for the restaurant had passed. And so, you know, this is also a clarion call for you all, that if you have a story to tell, you know, you need to dig deep and see why you want to tell it and figure out how to tell it, and not wait for someone's permission. you know, if we wait for people's permission, we're not going to do anything. Like, at least not anything that evokes change. We need to think about, you know, what are the stories that we don't see out there, and what are the ways that we can get them out there. And so the book coins a few terms, and it's a way of like trying to tell the story of the Nayarit as a place, but also to show people that if they want to do a study of this, like how to do it. And so I talk about the immigrants here. This is my grandmother, who I call Doña Natalia in the book. I talk about them as placemakers because they were establishing a sense of place for immigrants. They were establishing a safe space. Usually when you like map a city, and we're going to do cognitive mapping in one of the classes that I'm working on or that I'm teaching right now at school, we think about major institutions, schools, churches, hospitals. We don't necessarily think about these unofficial spaces, right? And it's these placemakers that make that happen. What became very clear in my interviews were all the people who said that they went to the restaurant first and foremost for the food, which I'll talk about in a couple of minutes, but because they felt safe there, because this was a place that they could speak in Spanish. They could make the sign of the cross before they had their meal. They could meet people that were like themselves or reunite with friends. So it was a place that they felt safe. And compare this, my grandmother opened this restaurant in 1951 and went to about 1976. Compare what LA looked like at this time in 1951. You couldn't necessarily go to the beach or to any beach, they were segregated. You couldn't necessarily go to a public pool, they were segregated. At one of the talks I went to, one of the people that came up to me afterwards said that his dad had worked at a brickyard around this time, Simon's Brickyard, and that they would go to the public pool the day before it was drained, because that was the only day Mexicans were allowed, because the belief was that they were dirty Mexicans and they would, you know, soil the water. So they would wipe themselves in the brick dust from Simon's Brickyard and jump in the water, and the water would turn brown. And they're like, you wanted that? We brought it, right? So it's not like Mexicans could move around as easily at this time. I also talk about restaurants as being urban anchors, like I mentioned, right? That we want to see, what does the community look like? Not just as a city planner would design it, but as a community actually inhabits it. That's where that cognitive mapping exercise that I mentioned comes up, where like when you think about what spaces are important to you in your daily life, it's often these unofficial anchors, what I call these urban anchors. And again, that this is a time where Mexicans have come to the Southwest. By 1930, LA has the largest population of a city, only second to Mexico City. And you can say this for so many other immigrant groups, right? Armenians, Filipinos, Thais, on and on. So that this is a time where immigration is increasing. By the 1950s, that you actually have an eclipse of the immigrant generation with now second generation. And yet they're still facing so much discrimination. And so what does it mean to have this kind of safe space? I also talk about a place like Echo Park. Like, why is it that my grandmother could open a restaurant there? Here she was, a single woman from Mexico. She ends up marrying somebody, and mainly to adopt 2 kids from a waitress that worked at the restaurant who passed from tuberculosis in the 1930s. And so she adopts my mother and my mother's brother, Carlos. And her first restaurant is like right outside of Alvera Street off of Sunset Boulevard. And when the owner of the restaurant that she was leasing it from says, you know, at the end of your lease, I'm going to, I need you to close the restaurant. He was selling the property or something. She could have chosen to go a mile and a half east and been in Boyle Heights, East LA, been around a lot more Spanish speakers, more people like herself. But instead, she chooses to go a mile and a half west. And I think that decision alone made as much of a difference in her life than traversing the 1,300 miles that she did to come from Mexico, because she ended up in a much more liberal, unstructured space of Echo Park, where somebody like her, a single mom, somebody like her who hired gay workers, somebody like her who was just unconventional could thrive in this neighborhood that was also full of immigrants. If you look at the census data, and I go through all the census data in the book, it looks like Echo Park is already, or is at that point still a pretty white space. But if we go through the census and see who's there, we see that white often means white immigrants, ethnic immigrants. So her landlord was Jewish. He had fled, the Ottoman Empire. Another neighbor was Italian. Another neighbor was Hungarian, and they were all another neighbor was French, and they were all operating their restaurants as immigrants. And so they all had somewhat of an understanding, a shared sense of community with one another. And this was a time, not just with the owners of those businesses, but of the residents. This is a time when, here's a map of the Homeowners Loan Corporation from 1939, which is the agency that gives out mortgages, that funds mortgages, federally backed mortgages for people wanting to buy a house. But if you want to buy a house or a business and it's in a green area, you're likely to get the loan. But if it's in a red area, that's where we get the term redlining from, you're not going to get that loan. It's seen as an area that you should not invest in. And you think, oh, well, is it an unsafe area? Is it like, on an earthquake fault? Is it, a fire hazard area? No, a lot of it was seen as dangerous because there were working class folks living there, and or there were people of color living there. And the more diversity, as much as, diversity is touted now, diversity was seen as a negative for that. And Echo Park was one of these overlooked areas. It's no accident then that, around the time my grandmother opens a restaurant, that Chavez Ravine, that the residents there are displaced, and Chavez Ravine is in the backyard of Echo Park. So this was an area that people that kind of didn't fit into the more conventional places went. It was established by artists, by woodworkers, by printmakers, by writers. It's where the first gay society, the Mattachine Society, was created. There was a lot of people that were used to living somewhat on the margins, and it was a place where you didn't have like built community, what are those called? Like, built communities, like tract homes, where the deed was written for the entire tract, where one person, the developer, could decide, oh, if you live here, there are no African Americans, Jews, or Mexicans allowed, which was written into home deeds. And you didn't have that in Echo Park. So it allowed for a certain kind of flexibility that perhaps would not be afforded in other areas. So all these things help lead to her settling in not just a geographic crossroads, but a cultural crossroads. So to recap, she's a placemaker, being able to open a restaurant in this cultural crossroads, and the restaurant is an urban anchor. And so you start to see, oh, these are the ingredients and what you need to kind of think about in terms of how immigrants leave their legacy, rather than just seeing if they were in a text, if we can find them in a textbook or an archive, since they don't often leave those kind of records. And of course, it's a restaurant, the food. Let's talk about the food. But first I have to give you the context. This, just like I talked about the architecture in Balboa Park in San Diego and it being very Spanish, the food was still also very demonized with the people. So here you have Edward Roybal, who I'd mentioned before, and here he is in one of his campaigns. This is an ad from the newspaper, and it says, Councilman Edward worked to better public health services. He worked in public health before becoming a councilman. And to combat stereotypes of Mexicans, such as in this campaign. Is the Mexican diet adequate? Asked the California Health Department. Yes, says Councilman Roybal, the first councilman of Mexican descent in more than 70 years. To prove it, he is sending them a tasty open-faced taco, otherwise known as a tostada, and that have more health-giving qualities than the American counterpart of Coke's hamburgers and potato chips. Like, what an interesting ad, right? Like, that he's combating this, and we see that we're still combating this, right? The LA Times just did this whole issue on tacos, the Taco 101 issue, and one of the places that I talked about, because I got interviewed for that, is Villa's Tacos in Highland Park, and now they're in Grand Central Market, because he actually charges you more than like a couple dollars for a taco, because it costs money. for the meat and to have like to experiment with the food and to make the handmade tortillas. But there's such outrage whenever whenever you go somewhere and a taco costs more than $1.75. Granted, there's also an economy of it, and if that's what people can afford. But I'm talking more about the folks that are like, oh, we want to show this on Instagram and show we went to this place that's featured in the LA Times, but yet we don't want to pay for the quality of this, right? With these kind of fresh ingredients. And so we see the way in that food and identity are so tied together. And that's another reason why looking at a restaurant is so meaningful. This is not a menu for Nayarit, it's a menu for El Cholo. And this is preserved in the LA Public Library archives. Their archives are also extensive for restaurants. And there's this great book by Josh Kuhn called To Live and Dine in LA. So you wouldn't even have to go to the archive initially. It's always good to see, has anybody published on an archive or out of an archive so you can see what they have. And you see that this is a more typical menu than what my grandmother's menu, which was, it does have like soups and albondigas, and then it has things like Mexican spaghetti and hamburger steak. And so this is still a very successful restaurant, and it's still open, for over like 100 years now. But part of it is that it really catered to an American audience versus my grandmother's restaurant was much more about trying to, she names it Nayarit, which lets you know pride of place, her own pride of place. And she featured, while she did feature some like kind of ubiquitous dishes to make it more accessible, she also wanted people to have a sense of place of Nayarit through the foods that they ate. So she did manteles, she did Nayarit as a coastal town, she did shrimp, every kind of shrimp dish. She did a pescado zarandeado. So her chili was really hot. One food reviewer said, unless you are an expert, apply it with an eyedropper. So, she did not shy from those kind of things. And so you had the working class, you had the workers, you had the working class clientele, but it was also, and I want to emphasize this, like the judge that I mentioned earlier, it was a place that even celebrities went to, Marlon Brando, many musicians. As well as Jaime Jarin, who was the Spanish language broadcaster for the Dodgers and a National Hall of Fame inductee, for really teaching us the game of baseball in Spanish and inventing a lot of that vocabulary. So I interviewed Senor Jarin, who is as nice as you would imagine, for the book. And he told me, I said, you could have gone anywhere. You actually had capital and you had cultural capital and you were bilingual. Why did you go to the Nayarit? And he's like, that's where I felt most comfortable. And I could speak Spanish in a public place and not even think about it. So, right, all these kinds of ways in which that setting makes a difference. So I'll close with this, because as I said, I implore you to tell your story. And so I'm going to read you the very last part of the book. The community that grew up around the Nayarit remains tethered to one another till today. I think about this community when I eat from the dishes given to me by my mother that Doña Natalia collected. They're from the Franciscan ceramics plant in Atwater, hand-painted with apples and leaves around the edges. The plant has since closed, but it's a popular pattern. As a kid, watching I Love Lucy, my first English lessons growing up in a Spanish-speaking household, I noticed the Ricardos owned the Franciscan ivy pattern. These dishes say a lot about my reserved grandmother. I like to imagine her setting her place and enjoying the sheen and the color of those dishes, not just as a sign of aspiration, but also as a way of embracing the place where she lived and asserting her belonging. So I have told this story, and I implore you to tell your story. Thank you. I'd love to hear your thoughts. I'd love to answer your questions. I'd love to know your names.
I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about how you pick the topics of your books, because there is this undercurrent of race, marginalized communities, place, racial formation, but your first book's about public health. Your second one is more of a national kind of story, and this is a very local one. And your next project, the Huntington, also kind of localized. So is there a thread that you find from one project that leads to the next, or is it like, how did you find the topics for each of your books?
I appreciate the question. I appreciate your careful reading and analysis of my work, and you're spot on. There is a way in which they look different, but to me, they are the same because I'm really interested in, and this is how I teach. So many of my classes, they tend to have the same structure, and I've taught like 20 different subjects now, but they tend to be about what are the power structures, what is the structural, and then how do people work within that, and how do they navigate it, and how do they push back, and how does change happen? And so for the public health book, I wanted the public health book to be this about the community. I didn't have the record, so I had the top down, and then I read against the grain. And then what comes out in the first two books, especially, are what I talk about in my edited volume, which we didn't talk about, which is called Relational Formations of Race, which is when I was writing the Fit to be Citizens book, I was focused on Latinos, but I kept finding the ways that the health department was trying to bring in Mexicans, but then they would not offer anything to Chinese or Japanese. So I would literally like put those records on the corner of my desk, like, oh, on the margins, like, oh, they don't have anything to do with this. And then one day it was like, oh, they're on the margins. What does it mean to include some immigrant groups and not other immigrant groups? Oh, that's differential racialization. Oh, and so it's, and that I think came from growing up in Echo Park. That's the other thing. We're all going to see things differently because of our own lived experience. And yet academia doesn't really reward you as an individual or say, please bring in your whole self, right? If anything, you feel like sometimes like it's like confining you. So that book came from that. It was a community study, but from the top down. The immigration one, the immigration book, it was the same thing where I wanted to know more about these immigrants. But then as I was looking at the records, I was like, oh, there's this whole like immigration regime, which I talk about, that's going on. Partly because I've always been interested, like, I'm third generation already on my mom's side. On my dad's side, I'm second generation. My son's fourth generation. And yet we still get asked where we're from. And so I'm really interested in how assimilation, not like in a sociology kind of way, because I can't do that. I don't do that kind of research, right? But like in terms of race making happens. So then that led to that book. And then this book was one where I got asked to do a talk, and it had to be on something in California. It was like a keynote for a California conference. So I thought, well, I have been at least wanting to do this. And this is, this way in which we discount ourselves. I'm like, the topic's good enough for a talk. I know I can do this. And then as I wrote it and it kept getting bigger, I thought, oh, I think I can make this into, I think it needs to be, it just needed more space. So part of it is embracing the not knowing. I know I'm interested in this, so I'm going to write about this. And then once you get there, you're like, oh, it actually needs to grow in this direction. Okay, so I'm going to do this. Oh, okay, that's more than a chapter. And so there's a quote that I use. I think it's in my Fit to be Citizens book in the acknowledgments of a philosopher that says, when you're like driving down a dark road at night, you can't see your whole way, but you can see the space in front of you from your headlights. And then you get there and you can see the next space, and eventually you can make the whole journey. And that's how I think about the work. And so I think sometimes the main piece of my methodology is embracing not knowing and kind of being happy with the creation part. And that's hard, but that's the main part, is seeing where it takes me. And then knowing what you want, right? Like, no, I want, so the first book, I got a lot of pushback because nobody had really talked about race relationally in this way. So they're like, well, I think your book will be much better and we'd be happy to publish it if you cut out the Chinese and Japanese. And I was like, that's not the way I'm seeing it. So it's having to like stick with your guns. So. Hi. Jocelyn?
Yes.
I see.
And I was talking with my friend here, Marco, before about like restaurants, and I was kind of like thinking of how it applied to me, especially since I'm a business student. But at first I found myself like thinking solely in terms of like business and restaurants. but as you started telling your story, and your family story, I started thinking of how this also applies to what I'm working towards, which is like with civil engagement.
Mm.
And especially how you said with self-censorship, how diverse voices are so important in terms of like government, because we still censor ourselves when creating spaces that are meant to engage people like us, or people without funds, or any sort of marginalized group. And even when we start trying to create spaces, events, things like that, we're still thinking, imagining white people in those spaces and how they would use it. And one of the hardest things for me was like coming to terms with that if it's not me saying it, then no one will talk about it. Especially when you're not in a diverse space, or when you're talking to people in government who are relying on their reputation, you kind of have to voice your culture and how people will interpret it. And giving that perspective is like very important for how they build those systems. And specifically like civil engagement when it comes to giving and taking. Something that I know that I never thought I would like apply this to like what I'm studying, what I want to build. But like when it comes to money, like not wanting to accept free things, or having that culture of like not trusting your government, or not trusting people who are telling you it's free, especially when people who are undocumented, from undocumented families, where it's like, how is this going to affect my family if I take this? Or are you telling me the full truth? Because even growing up, you know, Hispanic, and being like a Spanish speaker first, you're kind of learning what to trust, what language to trust. So it's been interesting, like dealing with government specifically because the language is so different, and it's like, are we telling people the whole truth and not just like being clear in our language, but does that language translate well to people who don't speak English first?
Yeah, no, I mean, you raise a lot of hard questions. You raise questions about